Welcome to another Radio Who, What, Why podcast. In San Francisco, I'm Peter B. Collins. Today we're going to flip the words around a little bit and talk about Randy Hayes' ideas for a new Green Deal. Randy Hayes is a longtime environmental activist. He founded the Rainforest Action Network here in San Francisco. He relocated to Washington almost 10 years ago, where he is the executive director of Foundation Earth. Randy, thanks for joining me today.
Yeah, pleasure to be on the phone with you.
Always good to talk with you, and you're a smart guy who has deep thinking, and I always like to engage with you and see what you're thinking about. Now, you've written a 7-point plan for the deep planetary emergency that we are confronting, and you and I are speaking after a 13-day string of devastating tornadoes hit in the Midwest all the way from Ohio to Oklahoma. There were 500 tornadoes, and the flooding continues in the Mississippi River Basin. This is a remarkable year for climate extreme weather events. And do you think that it's waking up any people in the country who have been led to believe that climate change is not a threat?
I would have thought that, but then about 10 years ago, I thought the extreme weather events of the last 10 years would create the political will context for tougher action. You know, Category 5 hurricanes, the Katrinas and the Sandys and various droughts and floods. But they were short-lived. So I don't think we've felt enough pain yet, even from this recent round of tornadoes.
Well, at the president's suggestion, we have been raking the forests here in California, but the devastation of the wildfires of the past 2 years have really hit home, and I think many Californians now recognize that sea level rise in the future is a reality, and that the impacts of human activity and the carbon that we have generated are really hitting home. You have a term that you refer to it as ecological spasms. Explain that, please.
Well, what's going on is, planet Earth. What we really care about planet Earth is the biosphere. You can think of that from the depths of the fertile soil to the top of the breathable air. It's a very thin coat across the planet. But the biosphere is what gives us life. And it's getting spastic, plain and simple. That's what extreme weather events are. The biosphere is getting spastic on us. So we have eco-spasms, ecological spasms. We understand economic spasms. Most people were hurt by the 2008 economic spasm. But I worry even more so about the ecological spasms.
And Randy, as we look at this picture, I believe that we've actually sustained some losses in momentum in promoting awareness of the threats of anthropomorphic, human-based climate change. And also, we are seeing the deniers develop some really crafty approaches, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. In front and center, we have the Democratic plan advanced by Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez and Senator Markey, which they call the, and these terms get a little complicated, but the Green New Deal. And their language references FDR's New Deal for the American people after the Great Depression of 1929. You consciously flipped the order of the words and explain why you talk about a new Green Deal instead of a Green New Deal.
Well, the New Deal has a lot to do with, human prosperity, and we're all in favor of human prosperity, but that's not the entirety of the situation, because there is no vibrant economy, there's no social justice on a near-dead planet. So we've got to all put this in the context of the planet's ability to support life, the life support systems of the planet, and that's the biosphere. So what we really need is not an anthropocentric or human-centered New Deal. We need a Green Deal. We need to look at nature's needs. We need to address nature's needs because, again, there's no vibrant economy on a near-dead planet. So I think we need a Green Deal, and the 7-point plan that I synthesized from a bunch of smart people that I get a chance to hang out with and learn from is much more aggressive and broader, and doesn't just focus on climate change. Climate change we refer to as the great problem of consequence that we have to resolve. But to me, it's not the biggest issue. It's not the biggest threat to the planet. There are about 9 life support systems in the biosphere. One of them is our global weather patterns, our climate. But there's the hydrologic cycle, the health of the oceans, and several other things. And they're all in trouble, frankly speaking. And biodiversity loss, people don't tend to put that up as a top-tier environmental issue. But if we were to lose the pollinators, that's a third of the food supply for planet Earth and the 7.7 billion people on this planet. So these things all have to be thought of in an integrated, holistic system. We have to solve for pattern, and that's what I try to do in the Green Deal.
And Randy, you cite, for example, the IPCC. We have less than 12 years left to radically transform our economies, technologies, and lifestyles to avoid a planetary catastrophe. And in the extreme scenario, Guy McPherson, who is a retired professor from Arizona, University of Arizona, I interviewed him recently, and he makes a pretty credible case that we could see human extinction starting as soon as that 12-year mark in 2030. And he cites the warming of the oceans, the melting of the ice, the collapse of reefs, and the melting of permafrost, which will produce, in his view, an accelerating momentum that could be irreversible. Do you share that worst-case scenario view?
I was talking to David Suzuki up in Montreal, Canada, a couple of years back. He delivered a keynote speech at a conference called Degrowth, looking at a planned reduction of the footprint of the human economy. And his title, his talk was is it too late? And his bottom line answer to that question is, we humans aren't smart enough to know if it's too late. So McPherson could be correct, but we don't know that. Mm-hmm. We don't have a crystal ball. And at the very least, we want to go down swinging with plans that are commensurate with the scale of the problem and the timing of the problem. And to me, that really means we need to be looking at a planned reduction of the human footprint of our global economy, like a 70% reduction of overall energy use. Even if we went to 100% renewable energy overnight, if we had a magic wand, I don't think that's a good idea. All of that energy that we use, or much of that energy that is used, is for mining and logging and destructive activities that are undercutting the biosphere's life support capabilities. So we need a much more dramatic plan, and we need to begin to live quite differently under a different economic model, and that's the work at hand.
Let me thumbnail your 7-point plan. You talk about promoting a true cost economy, the end-to-end costs of materials that we use, a shift to 100% renewable energy, a shift to 100% ecological farming with plant-based food as the focus, protecting the web of life, restoring damaged natural systems to halt the extinction crisis, a shift to low-impact lifestyles of ecologically literate citizenry with declining population. That's a challenge. Ensure appropriate technology policy, and then kind of a catch-all number 7 of all the other things that we have to contemplate to address this very significant crisis. And one of the primary kind of divisions that you offer is that we ought to carve up the earth into 2 basic groups. One that is preservation of the planet, and the other that is responsible communities for humans. Talk about that a little bit. I think that's a very important way to focus our attention.
Well, there's some science out these days that essentially say if you look at an ecological zone that has unique flora and fauna, right, unique species, if you can save half of that, 50% of that zone, you can save maybe 90% of the species, right? And some of the projections right now is that with the amount of destruction we're doing to the natural systems, both terrestrial and in the oceans, we're going to lose 90%. Well, I'd far rather save 90% than lose 90%. And so half Earth is nature needs half is the campaign that I chair the steering committee of this emerging campaign, and it's to set aside 50% of the land area on Earth and 50% of the oceans. And the strategy there is to save 90% of the web of life, the real stock market for planet Earth.
And Randy, you talk about one of the fundamentals here, which is to keep fossil fuels in the ground. And, we do have quite a bit of energy production right now. The U.S. is at a peak in its recent history, and there seems to be no interest in dialing that back and leaving even some of the, most noxious energy sources like tar sands fuels in the ground permanently.
No, as long as you can make a profit hurting the earth, you're gonna. And so we've got to shift the economic model itself, the very rules. I like the phrase a true cost economy, because right now you can externalize the pollution costs, and tar sands is the classic example up in Canada. But even if we were to exploit that entirely, we'd shift to shale oil in northwestern Colorado. There's more oil in northwestern Colorado than the entire Middle East, but it's locked up in shale rock, right? But it's there. It's just expensive to extract, more expensive than tar sands. So the economic model itself has to shift. Now, we know there isn't the current political will to do so. I mean, we can't even get a bold, hard-hitting carbon tax, all right, to begin to, quote, internalize those pollution externalities. But it's not really so much about putting a price on this damage to the earth, pollution, externalities. It's about eliminating them. And a lot of activity simply should be just banned. I mean, I believe we should ban the production of all non-essential plastic. You want to stop the gyres of plastic swirling around the oceans and undercutting the fish populations as they engulf it and killing so many seabirds. Quit making plastic, right? If you need a plastic heart valve or something, well, okay, that can be essential plastic. We can have that. But if it's throwaway toys from China or anywhere else, it's time to just say no. We banned the above-ground nuclear testing. We banned the production or use of DDT in the United States. A ban can really radically affect things for the better. They banned above-ground nuclear testing because the atmospheric radiation levels were going off the charts. And that's been able to be held up globally. Even North Korea, when they do their nuclear tests, they do it underground. Well, we wish no one did nuclear tests anywhere, but at least underground is better than above ground. So at any rate, these bans need to occur, and shifts that are not politically feasible right now, but it's time at the very least to start talking about a 6% per year reduction of energy and material use in society globally.
And Randy, the military-industrial complex is a heavy user of carbon-based energy sources. And Senator Elizabeth Warren has said she wants to charge the Pentagon with addressing climate change. Tulsi Gabbard, also running for president, the congresswoman from Hawaii, says she wants to cut the Pentagon budget and divert that money into climate change initiatives. I see the latter as a more useful approach. But somewhere I read, maybe even in your document, that we have this cycle where the U.S. military fights wars over oil. so that they can get more oil to fight more wars over oil?
Well, it's a sinister scenario, and we've got to break that cycle. I mean, how to do so and guarantee some level of security is no easy feat. But the situation is getting deeper and deeper in that deep planetary emergency, and the military has some semblance of appreciation of science and rational thinking. They know what supply lines are. They know what logistics are. They know what they need to address a war. But they also know that climate change is bringing on more civil unrest. We've all heard, for the most part, most of us have heard that the droughts in Syria and the food price rises kind of was the straw that broke the camel's back to foster the disruption over there. And that's going to happen. There's going to be more failed states around the world. It's no easy problem to solve, but at some point the military has got to help lead a solution to the protection of the biosphere, and we're not seeing that yet. But I have some crazy level of hope that there's some rational thinking there with some of these at least retired generals and admirals that sent, a few years back, they sent a letter to every member of Congress saying that Congress needed to take climate change very serious because it was disrupting global security.
What about the agriculture sector? We know that methane from cows is a major source of carbon in the atmosphere, and we also are seeing farming heavily impacted by these extreme weather events. How do you envision a future for agriculture that improves the health of the planet?
Well, a couple of years back, Paul and Ann Ehrlich from Stanford University wrote an essay, "Can We Avoid Collapse?" And they really showed in that essay how vulnerable we are to industrial agriculture globally. In aggregate, it's a major source of greenhouse gases, of course, but it's also the major cause of the disruption of natural systems and the extinction of species, and the toxicity from the pesticides and herbicides and artificial fertilizers that run off into the streams and the ocean and the rivers and into the ocean. They've created 600 dead zones in the rivers that dump into the oceans around the planet from industrial agricultural toxic runoff. Right? So we cannot save the planet unless we shift industrial agriculture to 100% ecological farming. Fortunately, studies have been done that show that we can actually grow more food and better feed the planet from ecological farming than industrial agriculture. And we can grow our soils instead of eroding our soils and sequester a lot of carbon into those soils as part of an attempt to stay below 2 degrees centigrade average temperature rise. So that's a major focus. Those people that, particularly the Silicon Valley types who send out a message that 100% renewable energy will save the planet, it's the wrong message. It's a really insufficient, misleading message. It's probably more important that we go to 100% ecological farming than 100% renewable energy. But, of course, we want to do both.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. And we are seeing the extinction of species already underway. At what point does that become critical? And, can we write off certain species and say, well, it was nice to have them here on Earth, but they're not central to human survival, so we're not going to restore habitat or make other moves to try to avoid extinction of certain species that scientists may consider to be non-essential?
Well, of course, many species are essential to human life. And we can start with the fact that what is an individual human? It's a set of systems embedded in other systems, right? You have a nervous system, you have a digestive system, you have a circulatory system. We are systems embedded in systems. And no individual human would live without the gut bacteria in our digestive tracts, right? So we are fundamentally dependent on the web of life itself in so many different ways. And as I mentioned, the pollinators account for about a third of the food that's grown globally has to be pollinated. And many people have heard about the bee colony collapse.
Yeah.
In the last 18 months, there have been several reports on what people call insect Armageddon, a radical decrease in the number of insects. And just, and many aging boomers like myself can recall the number of splattered insects on a windshield as a kid driving through the countryside. And that, feels quite different because it is quite different. So we have got to protect the web of life, and that means a dramatic shift in the strategy. There hasn't been a plan on paper to stop the sixth great extinction, but there is now, and it's called Nature Needs Half, setting aside half of the planet, half of the oceans and half of the lands. With a team of conservation biologists, we did a study a year and a half ago published in Bioscience where we laid out that there are 846 ecological zones with unique flora and fauna. And we assessed how many of them have 50% of each zone already protected. I'll round off the numbers, but say that over 100 of those 846 ones already have half protected, and another couple hundred have at least half of the original flora and fauna in there and could be protected. And then the third category were another couple hundred of those zones that only have maybe 20% of the original flora and fauna, but with conservation biology could be restored to 50% and give us a fighting chance to stop the extinction of so many species in the web of life. Last point on the web of life is that when a species goes extinct, that's, of course, a tragedy in some ultimate sense of thinking. But additionally, we lose its function in the web of life. We don't just lose the species, we lose its function. And so if it's a pollinator of our food and we lose that function, we're in trouble.
And it can be part of a food chain for some significant species that humans rely on. So I do understand the interconnection. Randy, you also have points in here about shifting to low-impact lifestyles. And I shared with you an introduction to a woman named Vanessa Keith. She is a Brooklyn-based architect who has published a book called 2100, and she looks at 4 degrees increase in the heat of the planet, Celsius, by 2100. And she and architects devise plans for human adaptation. And in a quick thumbnail, Vancouver and Moscow are projected to be the most livable cities in 2100. And so they design areas for resource extraction, renewables, and high-density population centers in the livable zones. And while, you can quibble with many aspects of it if you wish, I think it is a vision for, as you say, going down swinging. And it gives us some ideas of ways that we can adapt and, in particular, change the buildings that we live and work in and adapt to the expected changes in ways that we might find confining or socially limiting, but they do offer us a clear path forward to survive as we face possible extinction.
We do face possible extinction. And so how does one think about that? How do you maintain some semblance of hope? Well, a friend of mine, Diane Dumanowski, once told me, sometimes you need to change what you hope for. And that makes a lot of sense for me. I used to hope for an elegant transition from industrial madness to a more socially just and ecologically sound society. And then I started hoping for a semi-elegant transition because I could see it wasn't going to happen in some pretty and sweet way. Now I don't even think there's time for a semi-elegant transition. But collapse of different systems does not necessarily mean extinction of us as a human species. So maybe what I hope for at this point is how do we rebuild post-collapse to that more socially just and ecologically sound society? And, the work of the woman, the architect that you mentioned, is visionary and appropriate. And the fact that she's gearing it already towards a 4-degree average temperature rise, Celsius, is quite interesting to me. I sent it around to a group of collapse thinkers around the planet, and they found her work, quite important. So again, if we go down swinging, it's still towards building a better world. And at this point, I think that may quite likely be post-collapse, but we still need to get that job done for future generations of all life.
One of the big points that you make in your white paper here, Randy, is that we need to make significant adjustments in the heavy industry and other technology that we currently employ. How do we approach that, and how do we get buy-in from the very profiteers who seem to want to extract every last dime from the status quo before they're, drag kicking and screaming into the future?
Yeah, in the 70s and early 80s, in the environmental and social change movement, there was a lot of talk about appropriate technology, but it seemed to have been dropped for a couple of decades. We now hear, of course, about wind and solar as but it's not even often called appropriate technology. Need technology policy on planet Earth because of a number of reasons. But let's take a look at the problem of climate change for a moment, right? And people say, well, climate change is perhaps the biggest problem that we have to face, and if we don't solve that, nothing else matters, right? Well, I don't think of climate change as a problem. I think of it as the result of technology choices. In the late 1700s, we invented the the steam engine, and powered it with coal. In the early 1800s, we invented the internal combustion engine and powered it with oil and gas. We made technology decisions back then that provided short-term convenience. Virtually no one at that time thought that this was going to have an unintended consequence of changing the atmospheric chemistry such that all life on Earth was threatened, right? So what is climate change? It was bad technology policy. And so I think we need to set up institutes on every continent that analyze the carrying capacity of the continent biologically and analyze the unintended consequences of new technologies. Jared Diamond, who wrote the book Collapse, has a wonderful quote where he essentially says that all of our current environmental problems are unanticipated harmful consequences of our existing technology. And then he goes on further to say, there is no basis for believing that technology will miraculously stop causing new and unanticipated problems while it's solving the problems that it previously produced, right? If you take that literally, that means we damn well better take a look at technology policy.
Yeah, fascinating. And Randy, I shared with you before we started talking a newly published report from an outfit called Little Sis. And Little Sis is an arm of the Public Accountability Initiative. They're a nonprofit journalism group based in Buffalo, New York. And they report on a new development. Industry, including the oil extractors BP and Shell, are contributing money to support the Baker-Schultz plan, which would put a $40 per ton tax on carbon emissions. Now, this appears to be the most brazen act of greenwashing that I've seen in a while. The entity that's promoting this is called the Climate Leadership Council, and it includes BP, Exxon, ConocoPhillips. Baker and Schultz are the former secretaries of state. George Baker and George Schultz and Baker, William Baker, I think was his name. Anyway, they are promoting a tax and dividend scheme And they've hired some high-powered lobbyists, former Senators Trent Lott and John Breaux. Joe Crowley, who was defeated, the congressman defeated by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, is now lobbying for the group at Squire Patton Boggs. And they are promoting this, I believe, as a way to counter the new Green Deal that you proposed, the Green New Deal that the Democrats are promoting. And it really is, to my view, a pretty sinister and cynical approach to the issues.
Yeah, I've taken a look at that because I know Ted Holstead, who's also behind that leadership council. He started the group in the Bay Area some years ago called Redefining Progress and did some good things, coming up with the Genuine Progress Indicator as a way to replace the GDP, the Gross Domestic Product, as an indicator. And so, you know, he is not a person who's trying to do harm. On the other hand, I think we're getting outmaneuvered, and part of what their package, their carbon tax and dividend, has another provision that would indemnify the oil and gas industry from lawsuits, and I think that's their real agenda. You know, we saw what multi-billion-dollar successful lawsuits did in the tobacco industry, right? Because of their heinous crimes of misleading the public. The oil and gas industry is involved in the same level of heinous crimes, only it's even larger than the tobacco problem, and they realize that would sink their ship. Well, they're sinking collectively our global ship, pod ship Earth. But I think that's what's really going on with that initiative, and you're indeed right that it's a scary and sinister development.
Randy, where can I direct people to get more information on Foundation Earth and on the 7-point plan, your new Green Deal? Well,
we have a website, and it's we abbreviate Foundation FDN, so it's fdnearth.org. And when you first open it up, you'll see our Pledge of Allegiance to the Earth that we developed for children, and you can go beyond that to the website, and you'll find the work of Foundation Earth. The subtitle or the tagline for this little think tank is "Rethinking Society from the Ground Up," and that's what needs to be done. It's time for a new way of living on this planet and a new economic model.
Randy Hayes, thanks for joining me today. Always a pleasure to talk with you.
My pleasure, too. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this Radio Who, What, Why podcast with Randy Hayes. Send your comments to Peter at peterbcollins.com. And I'd appreciate any contributions you can make to support the great work we're doing here at Who, What, Why.